October 1991. Garden Lodge. Freddie Mercury asked John Deacon, during one of the increasingly rare afternoons when John made the drive from South London to visit, whether he would do something for him someday. Not now, not soon, but at some unspecified future point that Freddie was careful. According to the account John's accountant would eventually relay decades later in the single interview that touches on this story at all, not to define with any specific timeline. He said, according to this second-hand account, not now, John, not for years probably, but someday, when it feels right to you, not to anyone else, I want you to reach out to someone. Just once. You'll know when. John, by every account that has survived, asked no clarifying questions in the moment, understanding. Across their more than 2 decades of working together, that Freddie's requests during those final months often carried a specific quality of deliberate vagueness that was itself part of the request, an insistence that the timing and manner of fulfillment be left entirely to the person being asked, rather than dictated in advance by someone who understood he would not be present to adjust the instruction as circumstances changed. Freddie did not specify, according to this account, who the recipient of this eventual outreach should be, though John apparently understood, from context that has never been fully reconstructed in any surviving testimony, exactly who Freddie meant, a person whose identity has remained, across the nearly 3 decades since, entirely unconfirmed by anyone willing to speak on the record about this specific conversation. John Deacon's public withdrawal from nearly every form of visibility connected to his Queen legacy, beginning in earnest around 1997, and continuing, by every available account, without meaningful interruption across the following decades, has become one of the more thoroughly documented patterns in the band's post-Freddie history, a silence so consistent and so complete that it has itself become a subject of ongoing fascination independent of any specific mystery attached to it. Within this broader pattern of near-total withdrawal, a single reported email, sent in 2019, 28 years after Freddie's death and 22 years after John's public silence began in earnest, has surfaced as a specific and unusually concrete data point, the recognition that John apparently broke his own long-established pattern of non-communication for one specific act, directed at one specific recipient, for reasons that trace back, if the account is accurate, directly to that October 1991 conversation with Freddie. The account of this email's existence reaches researchers, according to the limited sourcing available, through a single second-hand channel, a person connected to Queen's broader management and legal apparatus, who is described, without ever fully confirming their own direct knowledge versus relayed information from someone closer to John himself. An email arriving in 2019, addressed to a person who had, by that point, spent considerable time attempting to establish some form of connection to Freddie Mercury's legacy without success, repeatedly declined or ignored requests for acknowledgement or contact from people within Queen's official circle. The recipient's identity has never been officially confirmed, and multiple candidates have been proposed by different people who have encountered fragments of this story, ranging from a person claiming distant family connection to Freddie through his Zanzibar-era relatives to someone associated with AIDS research or advocacy work, whom Freddie had reportedly expressed private admiration for during his final year without ever establishing direct contact. While he was alive, too, in the version of the story that has generated the most sustained interest among people who have researched it closely, someone connected to a specific charitable cause that Freddie had privately supported but never publicly acknowledged during his lifetime. What the different versions of this story converge on, regardless of which specific recipient theory is being discussed, is the email's brief and unusually direct content, described secondhand as containing no more than a few sentences, confirming something the recipient had apparently been seeking confirmation of for years, whether that confirmation involved a family connection, a specific charitable contribution Freddie had made anonymously, or some other detail the recipient had struggled unsuccessfully to verify through more conventional channels. The email reportedly closed with a specific line that has been quoted in the fragments of this story that have circulated, with slightly varying wording depending on the source but consistent underlying content. Something to the effect of John writing that he was fulfilling something Freddie had asked of him nearly 3 decades earlier, that the timing had finally felt right, and that he would not be responding to any further correspondence regarding the matter. This last detail, John's explicit statement that the email represented a one-time act rather than the beginning of ongoing contact, has become, among people who discuss this story, part of what makes it feel consistent with everything else documented about John's broader post-1997 pattern of behavior. The recognition that even this reported exception to his near-total silence was apparently structured by John's own explicit framing as a single bounded act rather than any softening of his general withdrawal. The recipient, according to the account that has reached researchers, did not publicly disclose the email's existence for a considerable period following its receipt, choosing instead, according to secondhand testimony, to hold it privately for reasons that have never been fully articulated, though people who have discussed this choice have suggested it likely reflects a similar instinct to protect something that felt too significant and too privately meaningful to risk exposing to the kind of public scrutiny and skepticism that any claimed communication from John Deacon would inevitably attract given his decades-long silence. When fragments of the email's existence eventually did begin circulating, reaching, according to the limited sourcing available, a small number of researchers and biographers working on projects related to Freddie's final years, the recipient reportedly confirmed only the email's existence and its brief general content without ever releasing the exact text or fully confirming their own specific identity or relationship to Freddie, maintaining, in this respect, a discretion that mirrors the broader pattern of restraint that has characterized nearly every fragment of testimony from people who claim some private connection to Freddie's final months. What gives this particular story its specific durability among the many similar fragments of unverified testimony that circulate around Freddie Mercury's final years is the alignment it suggests between two separately documented patterns: Freddie's well-established habit across his final months of using his remaining time to quietly address unfinished personal business through carefully considered private requests to the people he trusted most, and John Deacon's equally well-established pattern of near-total public silence, broken only, when it has been broken at all, by specific and carefully bounded acts rather than any general softening of his withdrawal. A single 2019 email, if the account is accurate, represents exactly the kind of narrow, deliberate exception that both patterns would predict, John apparently understanding, across nearly 3 decades of carrying Freddie's request, that fulfilling it required stepping briefly outside his otherwise absolute silence for one specific purpose before immediately and completely returning to that silence once the specific task was accomplished. Brian May and Roger Taylor, according to every account available, have never publicly confirmed direct knowledge of this specific email, a detail that itself generates some skepticism among people who have researched this story closely. The recognition that if John had genuinely undertaken something connected to a decades-old request from Freddie, it seems at least plausible that he might have mentioned it, even briefly, to the two people who remain his most consistent, if limited, points of ongoing contact within Queen's broader organizational structure. This absence of corroboration from Brian or Roger has been explained by people inclined to believe the story's underlying accuracy through the same logic that characterizes John's broader pattern of behavior, the possibility that he simply chose not to mention it to anyone, understanding the specific request as belonging entirely to himself and Freddie, requiring no acknowledgement or explanation to any third party, regardless of how close that third party might otherwise be to him. The specific timing of 2019 has generated its own layer of speculation among people who have tried to understand why John might have chosen that particular year, 28 years after Freddie's death, to finally act on a request that had apparently been carried, unfulfilled, across nearly 3 decades. Some speculation connects this timing to John's own advancing age. The recognition that a man born in 1951, reaching his late 60s by 2019, might have experienced a specific and increasingly urgent awareness of his own mortality that prompted him to finally address unfinished business he had perhaps been indefinitely postponing. Other speculation points toward external circumstances, potentially affecting the reported recipient specifically. The theory that whatever situation had made contact meaningful might have reached its own natural point of urgency or resolution around that particular year, prompting John's response as directly connected to circumstances on the recipient's side, rather than reflecting any specific internal timeline of John's own. Neither theory has been confirmed through any source willing to speak with sufficient authority to resolve the question definitively, and the specific reasoning behind John's choice of exactly that year, if the underlying story is accurate at all, remains, like nearly every other detail of this account, entirely dependent on second-hand testimony that has never been traced back to a single confirmed primary source. Researchers who have attempted to verify this story more rigorously have encountered the same fundamental obstacle that characterizes nearly every claimed piece of testimony about John Deacon's private life since 1997. The specific and apparently absolute unwillingness of anyone genuinely close to him to confirm or deny details on the record. A wall of discretion that appears to extend not simply to John himself, but to the small circle of people, primarily his immediate family and his longtime accountant, who manage what little communication does occasionally pass between John and the wider world. This wall of discretion means that stories like this one exist in a permanent state of unresolved plausibility, neither confirmed with sufficient authority to be treated as established biographical fact, nor dismissed with sufficient confidence to be treated as pure invention, occupying instead the specific liminal space that characterizes so much of what circulates about John Deacon's post-1997 life. Fragments repeated carefully by people who find them credible precisely because they align so coherently with everything else documented about both Freddie's final year behavior and John's subsequent decades of behavior, without ever crossing into the kind of primary source verification that would settle the question definitively, one way or the other. What the story offers, regardless of its ultimate verifiability, is a specific and compelling illustration of exactly the kind of quiet, undramatic loyalty that appears to characterize the entire surviving structure of Freddie Mercury's closest relationships. A request made without urgency in 1991, carried in complete silence for 28 years, and apparently fulfilled. If the account is accurate, with the same careful, deliberate restraint that characterized both the original request and everything John Deacon has done, or more precisely has not done, in the decades since he chose to step almost entirely outside the world that once knew him as one of its most successful and visible musicians. Whether that 2019 email genuinely exists, whether its recipient will ever choose to release its full text, or confirm their own specific identity with sufficient authority to settle the question, whether Brian May or Roger Taylor have simply chosen, in keeping with their own well-documented pattern of protecting John's privacy above nearly every other consideration, never to confirm what they may or may not know about it, remains entirely unresolved. One more thread in the extensive and largely unverifiable tapestry of private testimony that has accumulated around Freddie Mercury's final months across more than 3 decades of continued fascination with exactly how he chose to spend the limited time he understood he had remaining. What can be said with somewhat more confidence, based on the broader and more thoroughly documented pattern both men's subsequent behavior actually displays, is that if Freddie Mercury did ask John Deacon in October 1991 to reach out to someone at some unspecified future point when it finally felt right, and if John did, in fact, honor that request 28 years later through a single brief email before returning immediately and permanently to his established silence, the story would represent one of the most quietly extraordinary examples of sustained personal loyalty documented anywhere in the entire historical record surrounding Freddie Mercury's life. A promise kept not across months or years, but across nearly 3 decades, fulfilled by a man who had, by every other available measure, chosen to disappear almost entirely from the world that Freddie had once shared with him.